Good afternoon, everyone. Today it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Lee Jussim, also from Rutgers University. Professor Jussim is a social psychologist who is also a distinguished professor and the chair of our psychology department at Rutgers. His work addresses political psychology, stereotypes and prejudices, and challenges to credibility of social science research. He's the author of more than 100 articles and 6 books, and one of his most recent, Social Perception and Social Reality, was was given an award by the American Association of Publishers Prose Award. He's also a founding member of the Heterodox Academy. I like that name. And he's an author of a rabble-rouser blog at Psychology Today that has a very large number of viewers. I think something like greater than 900,000, if I understood right. It's entitled the subtitle is Everything You Wanted to Know About Social Psychology, but Were Afraid to Ask, so we know where to go. I should say that I was looking at it today as I was munching my lunch, and it's certainly it certainly gets one's thinking, and also brought the occasional chuckle, which we all need these days, to me. One of Professor Jussim's recent grants is called Reinvigorating Social Psychology by Renewed Commitment to Mertonian Norms. So he is clearly in a good place to, this is a great place for him to speak. And without further ado, I'd like to, he will tell us about implicit bias, racial gaps, and scientific gaps. Thank you very much, Lee.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a great introduction. It is really a pleasure to be here. As I was saying before all this started, I am both sort of flattered and just really glad to be here. So, okay, so let's get on with it. So that the title is obvious. I'm going to be talking about both racial gaps and scientific gaps. And let's go to here. There we go. Okay, so the existence of racial gaps in all sorts of ways, they really are pervasive, and it's really clear there's a social issue and social problems to be solved. This is just police killings by race of victim over the last 4 years. Even though more whites than blacks are killed, the ratio fluctuates around a little bit from year to year. It's on the order of about 1.5 or 2 to 1, but there are about 5 times as many black people as there are white people in the country. So what this shows is that disproportionately black people are killed by police at much higher rates than whites are. So this is the most obvious one. This is in the wake of George Floyd and the social justice protests. This has really come to the fore. But there are plenty of other black-white racial gaps. This just shows information over the last 10 years on income, college degrees, life expectancy. The y-axis, luckily the order of magnitude stays the same. So it's income in thousands of dollars, college degrees in percent of degrees, and life expectancy is in years. But in each case, you have at least moderate to really kind of strong racial gaps. And then if you go even further, if you look through the United States history, the number of black people who have attained positions of power and authority and wealth is really, really disproportionately low. So one could spend much more time on this. Thank goodness people in the social sciences are working on these issues, trying to understand them and overcome them. But one sort of natural question that many people would have is that, it's been 60 years since racial discrimination was essentially banned. It was declared illegal by the United States government. So we have legal equality regardless of race, religion, and all that sort of stuff. So that kind of raises the question if the legal support for discrimination has been removed, how is it that 60 years later, we still have all these racial gaps? And there are lots of possible answers to that, but one set of answers involves implicit bias. Implicit bias, unconscious bias, hidden prejudice. So although it may be true that except for bona fide white supremacist groups like the KKK or the actual neo-Nazis, they're too small in number to sort of explain this ongoing, in some cases, not even reduced level of racial gaps. So in searching for an explanation, this is one of the sort of leading explanations that prejudice has gone underground. It's gone so far underground that people don't even know they have prejudices. And nonetheless, these prejudices kind of leak out and kind of emerge in other ways and contribute to these inequalities. At least that's kind of the idea. The notion that these sort of implicit biases are everywhere is itself everywhere. So it's easy to find implicit bias memes on Google, overcoming unconscious bias, know your implicit bias. I don't know if you can see it. That brain there actually spells out implicit bias. Implicit bias is like deeply embedded in the brain in some way. And as most of you know, this is obvious at this point, these sort of implicit bias trainings have begun to pop up all over the place. This is the Tulsa police, but it's not just implicit bias trainings. The top story there is from a woman who lost a lawsuit and then sued again, claiming that the jury ruled against her because of implicit bias. And it's beyond that. This is the lower one is just a blog. This is like this typical self-help blog that you might see on psychology today. How to identify if your lover is a narcissist. Four ways you might be displaying hidden bias in everyday life. This is just sort of everywhere. And it really emerged mainstream in the 2016 presidential election, where Hillary Clinton made several comments about the sort of dangers of implicit bias. We must fight implicit bias. And our vice president-elect, it has been really very strong about trying to both condemn and uproot and implement policies that eliminate implicit bias. So implicit bias is no longer in arcane corners of academia. It has leaped into the real world in some very, very major ways. As far as I can tell, especially as used outside of the technical laboratory research, the term implicit bias culturally has come to mean or refer to almost any intergroup thing we don't like. So here are some examples. Obviously, there are still gender gaps in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. There's more men than women across the board, whether it's academia or corporate or whatever. And why is that? Well, ample articles will lay the cause on implicit bias. If you believe people who are obese are less healthy than people who are not obese, there are academic articles, scientific articles laying that belief or characterizing that belief as implicit bias. When teachers pay more attention to minority students, that is implicit bias. When teachers pay less attention to minority students, that is implicit bias. So this is going to be a thematic point throughout the talk. Out in the world, as far as I can tell, the use of the term implicit bias has become, it's something like a rhetorical fad. It's certainly unhinged from any scientific reality or evidence. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's as if the way it's used out in the world outside of the sort of research community, it's like the mutant offspring of a financial bubble, a moral panic, and anti-racist demagoguery. So if the three of those all got together and had a baby, it would be the way in which implicit bias is used out in the culture. Okay, So, all right, fine. So that's sort of the cultural background. Scientifically, what is this implicit bias? What do psychologists think about what implicit bias is? Well, that turns out to be a really difficult question to answer. So like a subset of that is, how is it defined in literature? And one problem is it often isn't defined. So the most common measure of implicit bias is the implicit association test. Now, hopefully, most of you know what that is. Maybe you've even taken one. It's really not that complicated, but it would take 10 minutes or so to describe, so I'm not going to describe it. But what the implicit association test does is measure strength of association between concepts and memory. So, for example, it could easily be used to show that macaroni is more closely associated with cheese than macaroni is associated with great blue herons or car tires. And macaroni and cheese is a common thing in the real world. Okay. But probably, and I've never done a systematic survey, but experientially from knowing the literature, I would say a plurality of the scientific articles that I'm familiar with anyway, that use the term implicit bias, don't define it, and simply treat implicit bias as whatever is measured by the IAT. And so the reasoning becomes circular, right? So how do you know what you have is implicit bias? Because the IAT says so. Well, what does the IAT measure? It measures implicit bias. And this is really not a way to conduct a scientific field, as far as I can tell, but nonetheless, that does describe the empirical state of the scientific literature. Most people don't define it. Now, there are definitions in some articles, but the definitions are just all over the place in that. So there is no consensually agreed upon definition of implicit bias. So here are just a few examples. There's plenty more where this came from, but cultural stereotypes, association of concepts with groups, unconscious negative behavior. These things are just not the same thing. Stereotypes are not the same thing as associations of concepts, and association of concepts and stereotypes are not the same thing as behavior. So it's just this muddled mess of different conceptualizations as to what implicit bias actually is. So, I mean, I can't tell you what the field thinks it is, because the field is sometimes nowhere, they don't define it, and other times they're just all over the place. Okay, so Anthony Greenwald is the creator of the implicit association test and one of the foremost sort of proponents and advocates of the importance of implicit bias, both scientifically and in the real world. And he and I were both at a special National Science Foundation conference a few years ago that was organized around grappling with the controversies surrounding the IAT and implicit bias more broadly. And at that conference, he presented this sort of working definition of implicit bias: introspectively unidentified or inaccurately identified effects of past experience that mediate discriminatory behavior. And what I want to do next is seriously interrogate that definition in the context of comparing it to what the IAT actually measures, in order to evaluate whether the IAT measures implicit bias by Greenwald's own definition. Okay. Right, I've already discussed this. The IAT reaction time measure. So reaction time in psychology is simply how fast somebody does something. So if we were to test your association of macaroni with cheese, that would probably be something you could do very quickly. If we were to test how an association of macaroni with great blue herons, it would probably take you longer to make any connection there, because they're not normally connected. Okay. Reaction time with the IAT, it's really the differential speed under which you press computer keys in different conditions, but it's differential speed. Speed of pressing computer keys in no universe is discrimination. Maybe you could have a separate question of whether the speed of pressing computer keys is somehow related to discrimination, but that's an empirical question. That's not part of what is being measured. So the IIT does not assess, it assesses reaction time. It does not assess discrimination. People think of discrimination sort of mistreating people from a racial or minority or gender or identity group. It doesn't assess that. Okay, how about mediation? So I don't know whether physicists talk about mediation. This is how psychologists think about mediation. Mediation is when you have sort of a causal chain. A causes B, B causes C. A simple example would be, how does motivation improve performance? Well, first, if you're motivated, say, to be a really good tennis player, you practice tennis a lot. So motivation causes you to practice tennis, and because you practice a lot, you get better, and so you win more matches. So A is the motivation, B is the practice, C is winning matches, and so B, practicing tennis, mediates the effect of motivation on performance. And if that was all that was going on, if there were no other influences, if this was a causal model that captured everything that was going on, two people who were equally motivated, if you had two people who were equally motivated and one practiced and the other didn't, if this model is true, the one who practiced would win most of the matches. Right? That's what a mediation model is. Okay, mediation requires three variables, A, B, and C. In my simple example, motivation, practice, and performance. The IIT is a single variable. Again, it could be an empirical question, that is, do IIT scores capture something that is caused by something else that predicts or causes discrimination? You could ask that question, but the IIT itself as a single variable cannot possibly be mediation. So it doesn't assess mediation, it assesses reaction time. So we can eliminate mediation from the definition, not from the definition, but from whether the IIT measures implicit bias. Okay, then the third aspect here is this unconscious? Are people unaware of their IIT scores? Well, that turns out not to be true. This 5-6 years ago, this team produced a series of studies showing that people are really quite good. Like if you explain to them what the IIT is and ask them to predict their score, what they predict corresponds really quite well with their actual score. So it's not introspectively unidentified. It's not inaccurate. There's really no evidence here that it's actually unconscious. So we can eliminate that. Now, I do want to point out that the two things. One, by Greenwald's own definition, if you take his definition seriously, and if you compare it to what the IIT measures, the most common measure of quote unquote implicit bias, it's not a measure of implicit bias as defined by Anthony Greenwald. That is, if what he described or defines is implicit bias, the IIT is not measuring it. It is interesting to point out that what's left is the effects of past experience, and I don't think that that's a coincidence. There's a slowly growing body of literature suggesting that the implicit associations captured by the IIT actually have a basis in reality. So this is from a theoretical review a few years ago. The reason that implicit bias is widespread, and by implicit bias, they're talking about things like IIT scores, is that the environment has a constant level, a relatively constant level of disparities and inequalities. And as they phrase it, repeatedly raise the accessibility, right? The ease with which sort of the salience, people's knowledge of, awareness of, thinking about stereotypic concepts. Now, that stops short a little bit, stops short of what I would say, but not too short, because it's raising the accessibility of stereotypic concepts, because in this view, what people are picking up out in the world, according to this, is real inequities, real disparities, real inequalities. And so that's why I say it probably has a strong basis in reality. There's a much older literature on implicit cognition that has nothing to do with racism or prejudice or sexism or bigotry or discrimination. It has to do with people's knowledge. And people clearly know lots of things that they can't easily articulate. Probably the simplest example, it might be something like riding a bicycle. So when you're riding a bicycle, you're not sitting there deliberating about the motion of your legs and the way you sort of engage in micro movements in order to maintain your balance while no one does that. You kind of learn how to ride and it somehow gets in your memory and then you ride a bicycle. So Reber in the late 80s had been doing this since the 60s, this kind of learning, completely unhinged from prejudice or anything like that, and reached these conclusions based on 25 years of this sort of research. Implicit learning produces a tacit knowledge base, tacit, that is, it's not necessarily explicitly articulated, that is abstract and representative of the structure of the environment. It goes on, can be used implicitly, that is without much or necessarily any thought, to solve problems and make accurate decisions about novel circumstances. So a personal example of what he's talking about here is I'm an avid tennis player. And if you play tennis, sometimes I play doubles. Doubles is at the net. And if you're playing anyone who's at least moderately good, they can hit a really hard ball right at you at the net. The ball is going to take a half a second or less to get to you at the net. So, and your job, if you're a tennis player, is to hit the ball, volley it off the court, and win the point. How do you do that in under half a second? You're not sitting there discussing with yourself, well, the ball is coming at me at an 87-degree angle. It's about 92 miles an hour. And if I move my arm in such a way and hold the racket, no one can do that. You have a third of a second to make that decision. It's so instantaneous that it would, the better you get at tennis, the more able you become to do that. A little bit of that might be physical, but most of that is actually mental. That's the kind of thing that Reber was talking about as implicit knowledge. Okay. So this raises the question, where do gaps come from? And really the subset issue here is how much do IAT scores cause racial gaps? Now, I realize this is kind of a weird way to phrase it. The IAT scores are just the measure, but being that the construct, the concept is all over the map and means different things to different researchers, I'm using the term IAT score, even though it refers to the measure rather than the concept, to capture this weird medley of concepts that is in the literature. Okay. So if you just, think it through, demographic gaps, I'm going to focus on racial gaps, but really any gap is going to come from a variety, or potentially could come from a variety of places. One is the legacy of past discrimination. So between 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, the horrendous oppression to which Black people were subject to in the United States potentially has had such long-lasting effects that they are influential even today and continue to cause differences, whether it's in education, income, political power, or anything else. So there's the legacy of past discrimination. Of course, there's also current discrimination. To the extent that ongoing racial discrimination is continuing and is active and live in the present, that is also going to cause inequality. And then the third sort of general category are group differences that are more or less independent of either, well, I mean, they'd be in the present, so they'd be independent of present discrimination. And those would be things like cultural differences between groups or even biological differences between groups. Sort of my clearest example of a biological difference is that people of African descent are much more likely to suffer from sickle cell anemia than people from other areas. So that's going to cause a health gap. It's going to contribute to a health gap. So there are group differences that are independent of discrimination. Okay, so just heuristically, this chart kind of captures that. There's three broad categories of sources of gaps: past discrimination, group differences, and present discrimination. So this is important to think about because the IAT is at most a measure of discrimination in the present, at best. And it's not even a measure of discrimination, but to the extent that it has any relationship to discrimination, you know, people whose IAT scores are being assessed in 2010 and 2015 and 2020 were not slave owners. They didn't institute Jim Crow. You're talking about the present. But it's more complicated than that, because what the IAT at best is a measure of something about the individual. And it is clear that what sometimes is called systemic racism, I really prefer the term institutional discrimination, are organizational and institutional policies and practices that have the potential, and in many cases, the empirically demonstrated reality of producing inequalities or reproducing or supporting inequalities. That's just a handful up there. There's way more than this. So there's differences in school funding of predominantly black and white school districts. There's until not that long ago, the history of banks redlining areas and not providing loans based on geographical location, which just happened but just happened to overlap with racial grouping. There's even gerrymandering of congressional districts and maybe even more important, state house districts in order to make it more difficult for predominantly black areas to elect their own representatives. So, but there's way more than that. But those are institutional practices that aren't captured by running an IAT score, which is really just capturing an individual's or something about an individual. So I would in thinking about discrimination in the present, I would separate that out. There are institutional practices which may or may not, which sometimes clearly do cause inequalities. They may or may not be intentional, but they're not captured by the IAT. The IAT is capturing something about the individual. So I don't know, on my screen, it looks sort of like light green, light gray. That's the piece that constitutes individual level discrimination that I'm separating out from institutional discrimination. Okay, so how much individual level discrimination is there out there? Well, there's ample empirical evidence out there for ongoing racial discrimination. This is a fairly recent paper that was a meta-analysis. It's not a single study, so it's reviewing 20, 30 years of field studies assessing racial discrimination. And what they find is that the level of field experiments in hiring, and usually they're talking about callbacks and interviews, is more or less constant going back to about 1990. And you know, the headline finding is shown at the bottom. White applicants receive about 36% more callbacks. That seems to be continuing. So yeah, there's clear evidence of ongoing discrimination. But there's also other studies showing little or no evidence of discrimination. So this is a study that came out about the same time as that meta-analysis, and which was not included in that meta-analysis. This is a very large study. They sent out 9,000 fictitious resumes, and highlighted at the bottom is the headline finding: little evidence of employer preferences based on race or gender. So, okay, that's a finding inconsistent with that meta-analysis. This is a somewhat different kind of study. This is a self-report study where the researchers asked people what level of experiences of discrimination have they had. and I've highlighted the key findings. So about 2/3 of the Black respondents, and this is a large scale study, there are over 2,000 Black respondents. So I'm going to hold off here. I'm getting a fuzzy thing in my thing here, and I'm wondering if that's somebody is not muted or something like that. So maybe it's my thing, but oh, that's better. I don't know whether anybody did anything or not. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to continue. So the key finding here is that about 2/3 of their Black respondents say they never or rarely have experiences with discrimination. I think it was over the last year. Now, that is lower than the proportion of whites. It was more than 3/4 of whites said they had little or no, never or rarely experienced discrimination. But the difference is pretty small. Amazingly, when I discovered this, my jaw dropped. In the quest for validity evidence for the IAT, that is, does the IAT predict discrimination? Lots of those studies have to assess discrimination. Amazingly, and I haven't done this systematically, so I'm not making this as a general claim, but many of those studies, and here's just 4, there's more than these, don't find anti-Black discrimination. So the first shown up there, and they did not report this in the study. Fortunately, the data were made available so anybody could see this for themselves. There was actually more anti-white discrimination than anti-Black discrimination. In the other 3 studies, Green, Wishlinsky, and Stanley, and you see those are direct quotes from those papers, participants were equally likely to recommend medical treatment for Blacks and whites. The judges' determinations were not influenced by race. There was no difference in the monetary rewards given to Blacks and whites. So you put all this together, there is absolutely evidence of ongoing discrimination, but there is also lots of evidence of non-discrimination. And so, what is going on? And I'm not sure anyone has a really good answer, but actually this paper just came out, and maybe this begins to actually have a good, I don't know that this is the answer. It's at least a very interesting paper. So this was, and this is kind of relevant to a lot of us, we're trying to figure out, how seriously should we endorse and embrace things like implicit bias trainings at our own university. This was done at University of Wisconsin-Madison. The participants were all subjects, were all students. And they did these field experiments with 8 different samples. It's thousands of students. And what they found in study after study is that only between 5 and 20%, depending on the study, of the Wisconsin students treated students from marginalized groups more negatively than non-marginalized groups. So they would do things like they would have somebody dressed like a religious Muslim, a woman dressed like a religious Muslim in hijab on a bus, and see, would people sit next to her? And, most people sat next to her just like they'd sit next to everybody else. There was a slightly elevated tendency for a small number of people to not do that. There's a slew of studies like that. But the 5 and 20% is actually very interesting, right? This is the same thing as saying 80 to 95% of the college students did not treat marginalized students differently. And so, that conclusion was that, yeah, there is discrimination, but it tends to be concentrated in a small number of people. It's not this widespread phenomena that some of the cultural rhetoric would seem to indicate. Okay. So this raises I don't think it raises any possibility at all that there is no discrimination out there, but it does raise the possibility that maybe when we're talking individual discrimination, not institutional discrimination, we're only talking individual discrimination, that rather than the sort of big pizza slice on the left, it's kind of a skinny pizza slice like you see on the right, that there is an individual discrimination, but it's just not that large. Okay, and it gets worse from there, because as issues with the IAT and implicit bias have become more and more, recognized and identified in the empirical literature, some psychological scientists have gone back to ask, well, which really is a better way to get at prejudice? Explicit measures like questionnaire assessments, like How much do you like black people, white people, right? I mean, just very blunt, direct measures. And that's what Axt here is talking about. And what he finds is that the best way to find out about people's racial attitudes is to ask them point blank. There is a whole cottage industry of work assessing the extent to which IAT scores predict racial discrimination. Hold on a second. My things is let's do that. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, and those these are correlations between IAT scores and some measure of discrimination at the end of the study. And these are meta-analyses. So all of these studies are compilations of large numbers of studies that assess the extent to which IAT scores predict racial discrimination. But that's in a simple correlational test. And this paper came out last year, directly assessed whether IAT scores predict a variety of sort of bias-like behaviors over and above questionnaire measures. How much do you like or dislike black people, white people, et cetera? And what Shimak found was that IAT scores actually didn't add anything to the predictive value of explicit measures. So this actually raises this issue that individual discrimination, which is the only thing that's potentially capturable by an individual measure, is itself smaller than most people seem to think. And at best, the IAT only captures a sliver of that with explicit prejudicial statements that people explicitly endorse capturing some of that. So, when breaking it down in this manner, kind of what's left actually seems like a pretty thin slice. Okay. So in pulling this, so this is a book chapter based on this NSF conference. And in working on this chapter, we really tried to pull together.
You can ask a quick question. Is there such a thing as false positives on the IAT, in the sense that when you correlate with questionnaires, you find people that might be assessed IAT negative, but whose explicit views are, and is that an estimate of how big an effect that might be?
Yeah, so the best, I don't know if, so in psychosocial behavioral research, almost all of our measures are noisy and rendered imperfect by measurement error. So there are inherently false positives anytime, in almost any social psych study that does any kind of predictive validity stuff, because of the measure. We don't have perfect measures. We have almost no measures that even come close to perfection. Our best net measures are at least pretty noisy. So it's built into what we do. So usually we're looking at sort of group averages and trends, and we, at an individual level, we're not really usually diagnosing individuals. We're not very good at that. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, there has been a small number of studies that really use the regression lines, the predictive lines of IAT scores for behavior. And there are some people in the field who treat an IAT score of 0 as being genuinely egalitarian, non-prejudicial attitudes. So a score of 0, people, you're getting the IAT will give you a strength of association between things like black good and black bad, or white good and white bad. And so if you have a stronger association of black bad, white good than you do for white bad and black good, well, then you can get a reaction time score for that. If that score is exactly 0, then some people will interpret that as egalitarianism. But there's a lot of evidence that the IIT scores themselves are upwardly biased. So if you look at the regression line at the point at which the IIT score corresponds to actual egalitarian behavior, it is usually IIT scores well above 0, scores that would routinely be interpreted as racial prejudice or stereotyping or animus, that those scores are actually corresponding to egalitarian behavior. So I would say that's a long answer to the question. I would say the area is riddled with false positives. That's what I would say. Not everyone would agree with me. I mean, not everyone would agree with a lot of this talk either. So okay. Returning here, in this chapter, which is available on my Rutgers site, it's for download, anybody can access this. We really had to do a deep dive into these and all sorts of other issues that I'm not gonna have time to get to. And we wanted to do justice to the strongest evidence for the validity of the IIT. I mean, that's what a good critical review does. As well, there's all these bad, there's these weak studies and there's counter evidence, but there's also all this strong evidence, sort of like briefly, clearly gaps exist and inequalities exist, evidence for discrimination exists. You want to do justice to that. So there's this pretty famous paper from 2009 that advocates for the value of the IIT and implicit bias. It's subtitled 10 Studies That No Manager Should Ignore. So in doing our review, it's like, you know what, we really need to pay attention to this argument and we need to do it justice. And what we found was just really disturbing. So this is a table from that paper, and I realize it's really small and you can't really see it. So I'm going to summarize it here. Of those 10 papers, 7 didn't assess racial discrimination. They were like the IIT predicting things like pedophilia and drug use. And so, if you want to understand racial prejudice, you can ignore 7 of those 10 papers completely. They tell you literally nothing about racial discrimination. Okay, so you might wonder, what about the other 3 papers? So we did a deep dive into those papers as well. Those papers had 4 studies. One of the papers had 2 studies in it. 2 found no evidence of discrimination. And 2 did find what I'm going to gloss here as weak evidence of discrimination. Either the effects were small or it was a multi-condition study and discrimination only appeared in 1 or 2 out of several conditions. So, I mean, as far as I can tell, no one will lose much by ignoring the 10 studies, no one should ignore, if one actually cares about understanding racial discrimination. Okay, so because of problems like this, over maybe the last 10, this is actually from 12 years ago, but really picked up about 10 years ago, there's been this upsurge of scientific critiques of the concept of implicit bias and the IIT. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into any of these, but I'm just going to, sort of superficially skim them so you can get a flavor. So you can get it from the titles: Unconscious Racism, Concept and Pursuit of a Measure, Sexy but Unreliable, the impact of unreliability on the replicability of experimental findings with implicit measures, Strong Claims and Weak Evidence, Predictive Validity of the IIT, Implicit, What Do You Mean? A Comprehensive Review of the Delusiveness, Implicitness, Construct, and Attitude Research. So, Unconscious Gender Bias in the Academy, Scarcity of Empirical Evidence. So what is the point of this? That it's not, it's not that there's some like nutcase libertarian writing a blog, the guy's an accountant and writing some blog trashing the IIT. This is those were annual review chapters. I mean, I don't know what it's like in physics, but in psychology, the annual review chapters capture like the canon of the field. So there has just been this rising swell of sort of Mertonian skepticism about both the construct and the measure. So I realize I just did that very quickly, very superficially. The talk will be posted. I'm happy to share my slides with anybody. The website on top, the OSF-IO 74WHK, I've created this repository. Right now, it's about 30 papers and growing, including every one that I just flashed up there, that are critical of either the IAT or the concept of implicit bias. Or some of them aren't necessarily critical, but they walk back some of the more extreme claims that are now common in the wider culture and that still sometimes appear even in the scientific literature. I mean, they're obviously not the whole story, but the literature has been so flooded with, the literature and the society have been so flooded with these dramatic claims, it's often very difficult for an outsider who doesn't realize there's a very, very serious sort of movement of criticism of all of this sort of swelling up throughout the actual scientific literature. So anyway, that's an ongoing sort of living repository of a lot of that stuff. Okay, so let's do a temporary take home. As far as I can tell, use of the term implicit bias has become this sort of rhetorical fad that's really not hinged directly to evidence. It's not a measure of implicit bias by the IAT's founder's own definition. The role of implicit bias in producing racial gaps is at best not well understood. And its role in producing discrimination is also not understood. It's probably somewhere between 0 and modestly non-zero. I mean, there may be something there, but if there is, it's probably not very large. Now, this may make me sound too cynical, so skeptical that I'm like cynical, and I don't mean to actually do that. I use the IAT. I have empirical studies that the core method is the implicit association test. I think it's a potentially useful method. I think it requires much more basic lab research to really understand what it's capturing, what produces IAT scores, and whatever is measured by the IAT, what that causes in the real world. I think using it as a research tool, completely reasonable, appropriate, and potentially down the roads at some point constructive and valuable. However, having said that, it actually then gets worse. So there are studies, intervention studies, kind of like implicit bias trainings, that attempt to reduce people's implicit biases. And they produce no net effect on behavior. So this is another meta-analysis, conglomeration of lots of studies. And I had the meta-analysis is on what changes implicit scores on implicit measures, including implicit measures of prejudice. But sort of tangential, they do report it, and they don't bury this finding. But a secondary finding in there is highlighted, and that changes in implicit measures don't mediate changes in explicit measures of behavior. That is, if you change somebody's implicit bias, it doesn't reduce their level of discrimination. Almost as if implicit bias doesn't have anything to do with discrimination. There are other possible explanations for that. And then it continues. This is another annual review chapter that just came out. And this chapter is not just on implicit bias trainings. It's on interventions designed to reduce prejudice writ large. And as part of that review, they also reviewed implicit bias trainings. And I've circled like sort of the headline conclusion from one of the sections of this paper. And it's like, you can't make this up. Together with the lack of evidence for diversity training, these studies, referring to the implicit bias training studies, these studies do not justify the enthusiasm with which implicit prejudice reduction trainings have been received in the world over the past decade. That is the current state of scientific knowledge on this stuff, which does kind of raise this question, right? So if the science is so weak or indecisive or dubious, why are these trainings so popular? Well, one is they seem to provide the simple answer to why continued inequality. I mean, people love simple answers and they love a villain. It's like, yeah, you're implicit bias. This is a blog on my website. This is actually by a guest blogger, Jason Manning, who's a sociologist. And he drew sort of really, it's a great blog, a sort of amusing and disturbing parallels between the sort of cultural discourse and even some of the scientific discourse around implicit bias and beliefs in the supernatural. I mean, this is pulled directly from his blog, the main difference being an appeal to mysterious, unobserved, unconscious forces rather than mysterious, unobserved, supernatural ones. And it's a great blog. I really encourage everybody to read it. Okay. There are thousands of studies now and papers that use the term implicit bias, like peer-reviewed papers, scientific papers. Again, I'm not talking, your uncle's blog site. So there's like this high scientific-ness, right? It seems like it's really science. Like, look, implicit bias, it's everywhere. It's all over the literature. So, if you're an activist, this is a great rhetorical tool. Hey, it's science. What are you, some sort of science denier? So, it's really a great tool for activists. And then what about the trainings? Well, again, you have trainings by activists. Again, hey, it's science, let's change the world. And I think they believe that's what they're doing. And then, for consultants, I mean, the consultants get paid, easily 4 figures, sometimes 5 figures for these kinds of trainings. I mean, it's very, very lucrative to engage in these sorts of trainings if you're that kind of consultant. And you might wonder, well, why are administrators and CEOs hiring these people? Well, they have a public relations image to maintain. And what better way to say we take anti-racism seriously than say, look, we've had implicit bias training. On top of that, there is also this sort of defensive value, which I've captured here. Judge, this discrimination suit against us is completely frivolous. We're not racist, we're anti-racist. Look, we even have implicit bias trainings. So it's a way, for them to kind of protect themselves in case they get targeted by these suits. Okay, so I'm just about ready to wrap up here. So simple take-home messages. As far as I can tell, the term implicit bias has become this fad unhinged from evidence. I think implicit bias is a real thing. And I would personally think of implicit bias as a bias that people don't readily acknowledge. They may be aware of it, they may not be aware of it, but it is detectable in their behavior, including their ideas and their speech. So, the scientific and activist bias overstating the power and pervasiveness of implicit bias is, to me, a great example of an implicit bias. So I actually do think these things exist. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was really, really terrific. So what I'm going to do now is stop recording so we can ask questions, and people who want to ask questions. There are already 2 raised hands, but let me first, stop recording. There we go.